So the final question for this week has to do with facilities and construction, and specifically how a building information modeling BIM startup gains brand awareness in the data center industry. So how does a software services kind of company that's focused on building information modeling, BIM, BIM, gain brand awareness in the data center industry? It starts by figuring out how broad you want to go or how narrow you want to be. And a lot of that comes down to looking at your current product capabilities, looking at your current services capabilities, assuming you also provide professional services around that, and figuring out where you've been most successful. And if it's a brand new company, where you anticipate being most successful, understanding that it's much easier to get a beachhead in a narrow segment, to get success in a narrow segment of the market, and then expand from there. But if your company is well established, you likely have some muscle memory and have some pattern recognition, or maybe even a case studies page on your website that makes this significantly easier. And we're looking for the commonalities of what your clients have, your data center clients have, that need building information modeling. Are they located in certain geographic regions? In other words, is your company better suited to serve data center clients in certain regions than others? Can you truly serve globally? Or are there certain continents, are there certain countries, are there certain regions within countries that are a better fit than others because of the nature of language capabilities, location of your sales and services companies, perhaps localization issues around the user interface and feature capabilities and compliance and feature set, all the basic roadmap stuff that typically comes up. So when we're defining your ideal client profile among data center clients, among the data center industry, are we targeting globally or are we targeting specific areas? The next area that we'll want to confront is, are we equally suited to work with huge data center companies, or are we better suited at working with companies that are mid-market or perhaps even really small companies? For a lot of the companies that I work with, regardless of whether they're operators, IT facilities, construction, real estate related companies, they typically have a Goldilocks decision going on when it comes to company size. There's usually what's too hot, and what's too cold, what's too small. So there's usually, for a company that would be focused on something like building information modeling, there would be a certain company size that's too large, and there would be where they would more likely need a more sophisticated solution, or they would perhaps do parts of this internally or something like that, or the sales process would be too long or too complicated for us to be able to carry, a multi-year sales process or something like that. And then there's usually a company size that's too small, where you're aware of what your entry-level price point is, and they just don't have the resources to be able to afford what it is that you do. So with those in mind, you'll be able to back into a geographic location or locations, regions that you're targeting, and you'll be able to back into a band of a certain minimum number of employees, a certain maximum number of employees. And this will make it possible for you to use tools like LinkedIn Sales Navigator or LinkedIn Campaign Manager to really fine-tune your targeting for growing awareness in this space. And then there may likely also be some business model or industry considerations where you're better suited to provide these kinds of software and services than others. So wrapping that all together, that will help you create a target account list of the companies that meet the criteria, that look like they'd be a great fit, that you'd love to be doing business with. Usually this is anywhere from a few dozen to a few hundred, maybe a couple thousand companies in and around the data center industry. And then we need to know the individual kinds of stakeholders who typically want to be involved in these conversations with you, recognizing that in smaller companies, it may be a very different kind of stakeholder than in much larger companies. In larger companies, you typically would have much more specialized roles, and much smaller companies, you typically would have one person that's wearing 10 or 15 different hats, doing 10 or 15 different jobs at any given time. So this is where the size targeting really impacts like who you're actually working with, the kind of stakeholders that you want to educate and build trust with at these kind of client sites. And then from there, we need to understand the insights of what makes each of these kinds of decision makers tick and who's on the decision committee in general. So we'll end up with a primary buyer persona, the most important economic stakeholder. We'll end up with a secondary buyer persona, the second most important kind of economic stakeholder when it comes to building information modeling, and perhaps a tertiary or maybe even a negative buyer persona, where when that person gets involved, it's like the kiss of death to our sales process because we just can't work with them. So with all of that in mind, we'll take the primary and the secondary, do the research, and figure out what their biggest goals are that they're trying to achieve in their job, what their team is working on, what their company is working on, and how building information modeling could help them. We'll also look at what they're stressed out about, what they're struggling with, what's causing them to miss being home in time for dinner in the evening, or messing up their vacation plans and causing them to not be around their friends and family and loved ones as much as they would like to be, because stress around building information modeling is really messing things up. So once we have the consensus on that, it becomes a lot more straightforward to create a content calendar, an educational events calendar, where we show up early and often as teachers, trusted advisors, consultants, subject matter experts, and thought leaders around anything and everything that's relevant to these kinds of stakeholders in these kinds of companies at the intersection of building information modeling, recognizing that early on, these kinds of stakeholders likely are not looking for building information modeling. That's usually something that would come in the middle to the late stages of the buyer's journey. And again, you need to, as part of your research, you'll map out the buyer's journey, but it's very likely that you'll be intercepting them on a goal or a challenge that's 2, 3, 4 or more steps ahead of them recognizing that they need a building information modeling decision. So this is where the research and getting these topics, these ideas in their own words is so incredibly important. If you just interview internal stakeholders and you go with their assumptions, a lot of times you can really miss the much more important parts of figuring out what it takes to gain awareness in the data center industry when it comes to your company's building information modeling. So this is advice that would be useful for a startup. This is advice that would be useful for a scale up, an established business. And it really just depends on where you are with your company's product roadmap, the level of maturity, how many people within your company can work on these on a regular basis. I've also seen people have a lot of success using podcasts and webinars and live streams as a thought leader to double dip a combination of creating event experiences, evergreen content for repurposing, and at the same time, continuing to create awareness and gain valuable insight as to what's going on in your industry. And you could use a combination of internal thought leaders who have some expertise that would be interesting to this particular market segment, and interview other experts in the space. Some of these experts could be your early adopters, your early clients. Some of them could just be other experts in the industry who like to get in front of a microphone and talk about anything and everything relating to building information modeling and the steps that come much earlier on in the journey. How do you know who has an affinity for being on a podcast or being on a webinar or a live stream or something like that? Because you look for signs that they are doing this elsewhere, because maybe they have their own podcast. Maybe they appear on their own company's webinars. Maybe they appear on other people's podcasts and webinars. Perhaps they speak at events on a regular basis. Maybe they guest blog. Perhaps they've published research around this. Perhaps they're active on LinkedIn or YouTube or something like that, sharing this kinds of information on a regular basis. But there's usually some breadcrumb trail of people that like to consider this community outreach, consider this education and awareness building a core part of what they're doing in their career that helps build their personal brand, their professional brand, and their company's brand. So that's another way where you can create awareness and continue to educate and trust and build trust by these collaborations, these education and trust building, thought leadership, subject matter expertise kind of collaborations for the most important stakeholders who'd be most likely to be interested in your company's building information modeling product and professional services around that. So given all of that, that's how I would approach how a building information modeling BIM startup can gain, brand awareness in and around the data center industry. And of course, you're going to want to deploy your own muscle memory and experience in the space to get even sharper and iterate in everything over time. But at the end of the day, most of your buyers don't want to spend a ton of time with vendors and sales contact until they're very far along in that buyer's journey. We need to figure out a way to get you in as early as possible, as often as possible, so you're involved in as many of those typical 28 touch points between complete stranger and purchase decision throughout the full buyer's journey, and showing up as the teacher, the subject matter expert, the trusted advisor, the consultant, the thought leader. That's the unlock for making all of this work. So those are my thoughts on how building information modeling startups can gain brand awareness in and around the data center industry.